Hi, everyone. I think we're ready to get started. Welcome. It is my distinct pleasure to invite you to join us today for the Project Edge Cost Benefit Analysis Final Report webinar. My name is Alina Dini, and I'm here on behalf of Deloitte Access Economics. Really pleased to present to you the findings of our work today. First, of course, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of our country throughout Australia and recognize their continuing connection to the land, waters, and culture. We pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Today, I'm joining from Brisbane and acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people. A tremendous amount of work has gone into all of the findings of the Project Edge CBA, as well as the project generally. And we would just like to take a moment to thank each and every single one of you for your active participation in the program, including joining today, but throughout the last 2 years and a bit. And a special acknowledgement, of course, to the project team, so including the CBA's project team members represented by AMO, AusNet, and Mondo, who have been integral in supporting what is a foundational piece of work in Australia in the energy market. And also would like to especially acknowledge ARENA, who have done some great work in the DER integration space, but specifically supporting this project through its release. Now, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Deloitte Access Economics and the team. So I am representing Deloitte as the project director for the CBA. Have a couple of colleagues joining us today, so namely Jacob Sando, who will be presenting on the methodology and the findings, who is our technical lead on the CBA and also our project manager. And we also have Ezra Beeman, the managing director for Energea, joining us today. So what happened within the CBA, and more importantly, what is its role within Project Edge? So a CBA, as you may know, is a cost-benefit analysis, and it was incredibly important to the project team that there was a quantification of the benefits of DER integration and the coordination of DER in the Project Edge through a CBA. So we were engaged to support the project team in quantifying the activities under Project Edge. We also were supported by Energea, a boutique consultancy whose role in the energy market has been substantive and whose contribution to the CBA was to provide techno-economic modeling. As you may know, the CBA was done independently. So while we worked really closely with the project team and the project participants, the quantification and the establishment of the assumptions underpinning that were developed by us. We hope that you will realize that policymakers have this assessment and its associated costs and benefits within the NEM to support DER integration going forward. The CBA utilizes, where practical, the most recent data and forecasts. So while we understand the energy market is a really quickly moving space, we used whatever information we could that was available through extensive consultation, noting that while the conclusion of that process occurred in March of 2023, and a lot has happened since then, what we have put forward today, we think, are the best insights of the currently available market information. The CBA covers a 20-year time horizon, so that's from financial year 23 to financial year 42. So you will see pretty big numbers represented in the CBA that capture all of the incremental changes that might occur through a Project Edge arrangement over that period of time. Lots of detail provided in the actual report, which you'll have an opportunity to download when we share some of those links a little bit later. Now, the CBA isn't intended to act as a business or investment case for individual market participants, but it is designed to support research analysis and implementation going forward. The applicability of the findings is relevant to the understanding of the NEM as a setup to March of 2023. And we are really grateful for all of the voluntary contributions of the project participants and stakeholders with whom we've consulted, including DER aggregators and non-participating DER aggregators and technology vendors. On the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see the publications relating to the CBA that were published related to Project Edge. So there are sort of 4 main pieces of work that will help you understand the journey and how we got to this point, because it has been a really extended process and so many contributions have been made by so many that have helped us inform thinking. And what you'll see through the publication process is that there has been an evolution of the work, which is really important. So For starters, many of you have contributed to the CBA methodology, which was published in November of 2022. Now, that methodology has been updated with the release of the final CBA. So if you're to go back to the Project Edge website, you're able to access and download that methodology, which presents the approach that we undertook over many months leading up to its publication in November 22, as well as a page outlining the differences between what was actually enacted in the CBA and what you saw before. A couple of minor changes. We'll refer to some of them today, but feel free to have a review of that to bring yourselves back up to speed. It's a really incredible document, and a lot of what is found within the CBA methodology isn't completely available in the public report, the final report, such that you can go back and refer to the methodology separately. Otherwise, it is a lot of reading. Next, we have the CBA Final Report Executive Summary. So that's a complement to this final report presentation that we have for you today. The CBA Final Report Executive Summary is a short read. It's got a lot of great visuals that we think are perfect for the C-suite. So if you have any need to brief up or provide advice to anyone in the market around what was presented in the CBA for Project Edge, we think the executive summary is an excellent starting point for that. For additional detail, feel free to access the final report, which is a summary of the key findings and the implications of the findings of the CBA, which we are presenting on today. Lots of detail in there, a lot more graphs and charts and details around how the quantification that took place. So anything that you might not have answered today, we'll have some questions at the end, but feel free to review those documents as well on conclusion. And then, of course, we have the webinar today. So a couple of housekeeping matters. As you may have seen, the recording is underway. So just note that we have that available after the fact, and everything is captured in video today. We're using Slido as a mechanism for capturing questions. So many of you will have provided questions in advance, which we've seen. Thank you so much for doing so. But you'll have an opportunity, if you have questions throughout the presentation today, to pop them into Slido, and we will review them a little bit later at the end of the session and answer as many of those questions as we can in the time allocated today. Now, in terms of our agenda, we've got just under an hour. I'll go through an overview of the Project Edge CBA next. Then I'll pass to my colleague, Jacob Sando, who will review the CBA methodology and also the findings. We'll hear from, in that space, Ezra Beeman from Energea. He'll talk a little bit about the techno-economic modeling that was undertaken on behalf of the CBA and how important that was. Again, if you have any questions around the methodology findings or the techno-economic model, feel free to place them in Slido. You can now see at the bottom of the screen the Slido number. If you haven't used Slido before, and I know not everyone has, unless you were on the call yesterday, feel free to just type slido.com into your web browser and then utilize that number, which is 2533541. That will give you access to the question. So not only can you ask your own questions into that browser, but you can also like some of the questions you've seen, and that will help escalate anything that you'd like to hear about in terms of an explanation. I'll also remind you that this webinar is focused only on the CBA for Project Edge and nothing related to the overall report. If you weren't able to attend the session yesterday, capturing the overview of the findings of the final Project Edge report as a whole, that recording will be available, of course, on the Project Edge website for you to review in your own time, as well as to review the documents associated with that. So now, without further ado, we'll take a few minutes and talk to you about the Project Edge CBA overview. And it is my pleasure to start with an overview of the key findings. So in terms of the Project Edge CBA, what we found was that the CBA quantitatively showed greater coordination of active DER in the NEM via the Project Edge arrangements can result in an incremental value to all consumers of up to $6.4 billion. The Project Edge arrangement also found that to avoid 50.1 terawatts of customer rooftop solar curtailment to 2030 and up to 257.1 terawatts across the 20-year time horizon to 2042. The CBA also found that greater DER export capacity and VPP uptake can lower electricity sector emissions in the NEM at a value in terms of the total cost of carbon of up to $2.6 billion, which is an incredible finding in terms of the massive job we have to do in terms of reducing emissions from the energy sector. Further, there's an opportunity to further unlock the value of DER by three key mechanisms. Firstly, removing customer constraints, particularly on solar exports, so that as many customers as possible can access the benefits from VPP coordinated DER. Number two, setting rules. So by way of rules, we mean efficient market arrangements for the efficient coordination of DER with clear sets of roles and responsibilities for market participants. Now we've summarized what those arrangements might look like under Project Edge, which we'll get into shortly. But as long as they are clearly established, we can ensure that those market arrangements will establish key DER efficiency. And thirdly, laying the foundation for DER market enablement with an efficient and scalable data exchange. This approach would reduce costs and expand customer choice. I want to spend a minute or two talking about integration of DER into the NEM and why we see this project as being so foundational to the energy market. So firstly, Australia is a global leader in rooftop solar installation. And while broad DER take-up, and by DER, of course, we mean not only rooftop solar, but battery storage, which has been huge in the last couple of years, and electric vehicles, which is increasingly growing in terms of take-up, it's accelerating. So consumers are becoming more aware of these technologies. They're making decisions to integrate them into their homes and into their lifestyles, as are businesses. But there are still a great number of barriers that exist in the market, and those barriers are preventing the realization of a large portion of the value of DER in the NEM. So I want to just spend a minute and talk to you about some of these barriers, because I think we can all agree how critical they are. Firstly, overly conservative and static export limits are a barrier. They result in the curtailment of DER for foregone opportunities, so lost export. Ways that we can improve upon this situation would benefit consumers. A second barrier are the fragmented market frameworks that exist in the NEM. So these markets, fragmented market frameworks, which would coordinate active DER, restrict the ability to provide both wholesale and local network services from the same DER portfolio. Thirdly, lack of standardization. In terms of DER data exchange, which limits the scalability of DER, is a huge problem. And lastly, social license. So these challenges for consumers and what the market faces for obtaining permission to allow third-party control of DER is still problematic. And these barriers have the potential to impact all consumers. So while they are very specific to DER, they impact all consumers by impeding the secure and reliable operation of the NEM as we move into a higher DER future, which we understand is inevitable. So the CBA looked at these issues and worked through the quantification of these benefits and costs to understand what the net benefit might look like, and established that in order to unlock the value from DER, there were key drivers. The first being customer coverage of dynamic operating envelopes. The second being the presence of a scalable data exchange. The third being the use of a local services exchange or an LSE. And the fourth being the visibility of DER. These drivers are critical to unlocking the value from DER and coordination of virtual power plants. So in unlocking this value, we have determined that we can provide the market with, again, just in excess of $6 billion of benefits to all electricity consumers in the NEM, not just DER consumers, which delivers greater affordability, greater reliability, and cleaner electricity. As I mentioned briefly earlier, these findings are the culmination of just in excess of 2 years of really, really detailed work and coordination across a great deal of parties. And Deloitte Access Economics worked really closely with our project partner, Energeia, to collect data and establish key assumptions that feed into the CBA. But we would not have been able to develop such a market-leading and strong proposal without the support of stakeholders. So our stakeholder consultation was, as I mentioned, a critical component of our work. It was something that we undertook essentially on a daily basis. And we are grateful for all of the input of each of you and for many others who aren't on the call today in supporting the development of the CBA. How we undertook the stakeholder consultation was essentially threefold. So firstly, we were participating in the Project Edge field trial by association and used that data to support our work. We also had participation regularly in the consumer forums. So I think many of you may have participated in the Edge industry forums. There were forums for market participants, there were forums for consumers, and also for anyone involved directly in the Project Edge trial. So those were places where we presented on our incremental updates to the CBA, specifically on the methodology, and then over time consulted on some of the work that we had undertaken to receive feedback. We also undertook the write-up of the CBA methodology, which you would be aware of was published in November 2023 and had an open consultation process. So through that process, not only did we undertake stakeholder engagement one-on-one, but we also established an opportunity for people to provide comment on the document, which many did. And we were grateful for that feedback because it strengthened the approach that we undertook when we published the final methodology, as well as when we undertook the CBA finally. And at different points in the lead up to the presentation of this final report, we consulted many of the parties on an individual basis that you see below, so including market institutions of the AEMC, the AER, the ESB, and of course AMO, broadly outside of the project team. Peak bodies of the ENA and Energy Consumers Australia, a great number of DNSPs, some of which who aren't mentioned here, so thank you for your contributions, but lots of heavy lifting from Western Power, AusNet, Ausgrid, and SA Power Networks, and that does include as well some of the other affiliate projects through ARENA that are looking at DER integration, so thank you to all of you for your support and engagement, and then obviously the DER aggregators of Mondo, AGL, Discover, and REAM, who provided lots of input and thinking into how we could nut this out. I'd like also to acknowledge some of the international stakeholders whom we consulted, some of which are part of the Deloitte network, but others of whom are undertaking similar work overseas. So while that wasn't a very large part of the work that we undertook here, given the specificity of the NEM, we did seek to understand what was best practice overseas, and that helped inform some of the thinking that went into this part of the work. So lots and lots of consultation, lots of refinement on the back of that, and lots of appreciation from us for your willingness to contribute to this project. Now we're going to head into the next part of the presentation, which is an overview of the CBA methodology. So I'll pass the mic to my colleague, Jacob Sando. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. So now I'd like to spend a couple of minutes summarising the CBA methodology. So we could jump to the next slide, please. So the CBA considered two scenario sets, the first of which reflects DER uptake assumptions based on the AMO ISP 2022 forecast, and these were used to represent scenarios 1 to 5. And the second set of scenarios, which represents a more rapid rate of DER uptake, form the basis of scenarios 6 to 10. Now, these assumptions for 6 to 10 are based on an Energea report titled the Renewed DER Optimization Stage 2 Final Report. And these assumptions are intended to represent an economic environment that stimulates greater levels of DER adoption. It's worth noting that the ISP 2022 did have a scenario titled the Hydrogen Superpower scenario that had higher DER adoption rates. However, ultimately, the high DER uptake assumptions used for scenarios 6 to 10 were determined based on having a greater alignment with the specific capabilities that were ultimately tested in the CBA. The scenarios, as presented on screen here, reflect a gradual increase in maturity against the base case in terms of the selected configurations of DER penetration. Scenario 1 and 6 represent the base cases, and scenarios 2, 3, 4, and 5 represent more sophisticated arrangements, with scenario 2, for example, utilising a simple DOE arrangement and moderate DOE coverage as compared to scenario 5, which assumes more advanced DOEs, higher coverage of DOE, and also a data hub. Specifically, 4 configurations of dynamic operating envelope configurations were tested: the constraint optimization frequency, the DOE customer coverage level, the DOE optimization methodology, and the DOE objective function. Shortly, I'll describe these in more detail. In regard to the market configurations, we looked at different means of scalable data exchange and also a local services exchange as well. In terms of setting the scene for exactly how much VPP participation is assumed, it's worth noting that all the scenarios assume 41% VPP participation as a percentage of storage by 2030, which equates to approximately 8.9 gigawatt hours for scenarios 1 to 5 and 16.2 gigawatt hours for scenarios 6 to 10. By 2040, 52% VPP participation as a percentage of storage is assumed, which equates to just over 34 gigawatt hours for scenarios 1 to 5 and just over 58 gigawatt hours for scenarios 6 to 10. So if we push on to the next slide, you'll now see in some slightly more detail exactly what were the dynamic operating envelope and market configurations utilized within the CBA. Firstly, different constraint optimization frequencies were considered, which refers to the frequency of updating the constraint optimization settings that ultimately govern the safe operating distribution network limits. Various different DOE customer coverage configurations were considered, which relates to the proportion of total DER that receive DOEs. So a VPP only was considered, which means only DER that is participating in a VPP would be receiving DOEs, and also 100% DOE customer coverage, which is intended to represent a bookend where all new DER connected to the distribution network is active and would be receiving DOEs. The third DOE configuration considered was the DOE optimization methodology, which refers to the methodology that DNSPs use to set their DOE limits for participating DER. The two methodologies considered were an approximation method, which involves analytical approximation of the network capacity, mainly using historical network and AMI data. Also, an LV impedance model was considered, which involves a load flow calculation using low voltage network impedance models, customer data, and operational forecast. And the final DOE configuration considered was the objective function for network capacity allocation. With nameplate capacity allocation, where DOE capacity is allocated in a way where the optimal outcome is a pro rata split of distribution network capacity based on the nameplate rating of the DER, and also a maximum service arrangement, which involves allocating DER capacity with the aim to maximize the volume of export or import from them. In this approach, higher DOE will be allocated to the DER facing lesser network constraints. Moving on to the market configurations. In terms of means of scalable data exchange, the CBA considered a point-to-point arrangement whereby participants establish dedicated bespoke connections to share data, and also a data hub approach, which represents a shared digital infrastructure for sharing data between the relevant market participants. Specifically, the CBA considered both a centralized and a decentralized data hub approach. And finally, the CBA also considered the costs and benefits associated with a local services exchange, which represents the interface to facilitate visible, scalable, and competitive trade of DER-based network support services between DNSPs and DER aggregators. The means for data exchange in terms of the LSE was tested on both the point-to-point and the data hub approach. Now, why these DOE configurations are so important is currently in a number of cases, operating envelopes are fixed at conservative levels regardless of capacity of the network, because they are static and need to account for worst case conditions. Dynamic rather than fixed export limits can enable higher levels of export from DER by allowing higher export limits where there is more hosting capacity available on the local network. Now, if we move on to the next slide, this shows all the different work streams that went into producing and undertaking the cost benefit analysis. So ultimately, field trial data, which, as we heard yesterday, was undertaken in the AusNet Distribution Service Area, Victoria, alongside further analysis and bespoke modelling from the University of Melbourne, was used to support the quantification of the DOE limits provided to DER in the LV networks. Energia undertook detailed techno-economic modelling, which I'll hand over to Ezra in a second to go through exactly why techno-economic modelling was utilised in this CBA and how the three models within the TEM interact and ultimately drove some of the insights that were found in the CBA. And alongside this techno-economic modelling, there was also additional modelling undertaken around scalable data exchange, visibility of DER, and local services exchange. And as Alina touched on before, all elements of the CBA process and workflow were underpinned by strong stakeholder engagement to test and challenge key inputs and assumptions and outputs along the way. I'd now like to hand over to Ezra to spend a couple of minutes running through the techno-economic modelling in some more detail. Thanks, Ezra.
Thank you, Jacob. Energea's scope of work on this project was to develop and configure an end-to-end techno-economic model. End-to-end techno-economic modeling in the NEM is really only done by AMO as part of the ISP process. And that's because there's a lot of complexity in modeling from behind the meter through the distribution system into the transmission and generation or bulk supply system. But in order to do that, we brought together two of our existing modeling tools, USIM and WSIM, and we built a bespoke model to model the effect and the costs and the benefits of the impact of dynamic operating envelopes on network voltage constraints. Now, what you see here is a summary diagram of how it all worked. We had these models and we parameterized them based on the scenarios that Jacob just ran you through, and they included key assumptions around load and dir, constraint optimization frequency, the co-optimization model used, the dynamic operating envelope optimization methodology, and the target operating model. Based on that, we then modeled what the impact was on behind the meter resource adoption and operation, and the impacts across stakeholders, starting with consumers, the distribution businesses, and then feeding through to transmission and generation. You can see here that was done via a handover of the net system load profile and associated flexible loads into the wholesale market model, which is fundamentally a security constrained economic dispatch model coupled with a capacity expansion model. And then separately, the network voltage constraints were implemented. And this really is, in our view, a state-of-the-art implementation. And based on the work we do in Australia and in the United States, it really is on the cutting edge. Now, the relationship of the techno-economic model to the cost-benefit assessment was in the production of the relativities in the key outputs shown here, looking at what the impact was on the load hosting capacity costs, consumer network curtailment costs within the distribution network and consumers, and then on the wholesale system, the generator build-out costs, O&M, the impact on ancillary services markets, the TNSPs around load hosting capacity, and then the value of curtailment and the impact on emissions. The other thing I would say is that we had done the way that we actually implemented the model was using real world data from the field trials, and that was used to calibrate and benchmark a number of key points. The field trials can't do everything, but they can give us confidence in the assumptions we're using with those real world data points. The other thing is we expanded based on detailed information we had from AusNet's network, as well as the detailed modeling around network voltage constraints and thermal constraints under different conditions, thanks to the University of Melbourne modeling as well. So I'll hand back to Jacob, I think, to take us forward.
Thanks very much, Ezra. So now we'd like to spend a couple of minutes to summarise the CBA findings. So the key finding from the CBA was that all consumers stand to benefit from the accelerated and optimised integration of DER via virtual power plants in the NEM. Specifically, the CBA showed through testing the Project Edge arrangements that this can result in an incremental value to all consumers of up to 5.15 billion under the AMO ISP step change DER uptake assumptions, and up to 6.04 billion under the higher DER uptake assumptions. Specifically, Based on the capabilities tested within the CBA, the value of coordinated DER is enabled by 4 key things. Firstly, the DOE configuration. DOE configurations that enable high customer coverage and target maximum utilization of the distribution network by DERs and VPPs is critical for their success. A data hub approach to scalable DER data exchange can reduce integration costs for participants and allow access to a greater scope of service opportunities for DER aggregators and ultimately the customers that they are serving. A local service exchange provides a means of having a scalable and standardized arrangement for DNSPs to procure network support services from DER aggregators who co-optimize network support services and wholesale services within their DER portfolio. And finally, visibility of DER is critical for the market operator and DNSPs to improve their awareness of where DER is installed on the network and how it behaves, such that it can enable greater situational awareness, operational forecasting, and network planning functions, ultimately reducing the costs via enabling more accurate and less conservative operations across the network. As flagged by Nick yesterday during the broader report webinar, active DR participation in VPPs is the critical element to realise the value associated with the capabilities assessed within the CBA scenarios, as this will enable DR to make a coordinated response at scale to market prices and system security events. The figure on the left-hand side presents the incremental value of each of the scenarios against the base case in terms of the value that can be derived, with the greatest value coming from increasing DOE customer coverage due to allowing greater network capacity for DER coordination. If we move on to the next slide, the CBA also highlights the opportunity for electricity sector emissions in the NEM to be reduced through some of the arrangements tested within Project Edge, which is important given the current context of emissions targets across Australia and also the recent addition of an emissions objective into the NEO. This emissions reduction is driven by DER displacing fossil fuel generators, which is supported primarily through greater DOE customer coverage that allows more network capacity to be unlocked and utilised by DER participating in VPPs. A social cost of carbon was utilised to assess the avoided emissions in terms of tonnes of CO2 equivalent. A social cost of carbon represents a societal welfare point of view, and specifically the social cost of carbon price used in this CBA was $101 per tonne of CO2 equivalent in the base year, which escalated up to $147 approximately per tonne of CO2 equivalent by FY42. Ultimately, the CBA found that across the 20-year time horizons, total emissions avoided value can be up to 1.54 billion under the AMO ISP step change DER uptake assumptions and up to 2.6 billion under the high DER uptake assumptions. So looking back at the market configurations tested within Edge, it was found that these arrangements can enable significant value for DER customers. Specifically, a data hub approach to scalable DER data exchange can reduce costs and facilitate additional DER service opportunities more effectively compared to a point-to-point approach. In comparison to that point-to-point approach, a centralized data hub could reduce costs by up to 0.44 billion across the 20-year model time horizon, and a decentralized hub could reduce this cost by approximately $0.45 billion. A data hub, in addition, could deliver further upside through facilitating new DER-based service innovations more easily and at lower costs, given it simplifies integration, identity verification, and reporting between participants. In terms of the LSE, a local services exchange was found to provide a cost-effective alternative for DNSPs seeking network support services. Specifically, the implementation of an LSE can result in an incremental value of up to 0.08 billion under the AMO ISP step change assumptions and up to 0.51 billion under the high DER uptake assumptions based only on the use of an LSE to reduce DER export curtailment. The CBA found that the cost to implement an LSE via a data hub arrangement as compared to the alternative point-to-point arrangement would be approximately $9 million lower due to the reduced number of integration points required. And then just emphasizing, as I said before, the value of the network support services is directly linked to an ability to relieve network constraints, which are locational and temporal. The CBA has adopted a conservative approach based only on looking at DER export curtailment in terms of the LSE. Moving on to the next slide, we see that a number of additional areas of benefits could arise going forward. However, were not included in the CBA due to limitations at the point in time in data availability. Specifically, the CBA can be seen to represent a conservative estimate of the value of benefits. Given, for example, vehicle-to-grid coordination was not considered, which given there's increasing uptake of electric vehicles in Australia, V2G is expected to increase the opportunity and value associated with coordinated DER participating in a VPP, given there's more DER capacity to coordinate. There's also expected to be a compounding effect of the market configurations on DER uptake, which means that the effective integration of DER and the NEM via some of the market configurations tested within Edge that enable a cost reduction or access to a greater scope of service opportunities could feasibly result in direct or indirect incentives to install more DER and increase VPP uptake going forward. And finally, additional DER services. Effective market configurations have the potential to facilitate further value from DER as industry matures and needs evolved by enabling new DER-based service innovations to be more easily adopted. Moving on to the next slide, it is clear that coordinated DER can provide value across the full value chain. And in practice, it's expected that much of this value would ultimately flow through to electricity customers in the NEM. The chart on the left presents the incremental value per market participant for each of the scenarios against the different base cases, with the findings showing that increased opportunities for DER aggregators and as a consequence, their customers due to a reduction in DER export curtailment, the partial displacement of large generators enabled via wholesale integration of active DER, the provision of contingency FCAS and local network support services, and also a reduction in data exchange costs. For DNSPs, costs in maintaining and increasing the capacity of their distribution networks and the costs associated with data exchange can be reduced. For TNSPs, again, costs in maintaining and increasing the capacity of the transmission network can be reduced. And finally, there's opportunity for lower costs for the market operator to reduce data exchange costs and enhance management of the power system security due to greater visibility of active DER. The Project Edge arrangement of roles and responsibilities, which was based on the hybrid model for integrating DER, underpins the realisation of value identified in the CBA. As emphasised by Nick yesterday, the key feature of the Edge arrangement of roles and responsibilities involves DER aggregators on behalf of their DER customers receiving the necessary external signals and being able to co-optimise DER portfolios across wholesale and B2B opportunities, as this allows the prioritisation of the interests of DER consumers in how their DER is utilised, which is particularly important in a voluntary market-based arrangements where customers have invested in DER, where customers who have invested in DER need to be able to perceive clear value in participating in the NEM through a DER aggregator. It also allows streamlined visibility with all service capacity for market and B2B services of a portfolio represented in a common portfolio level bid to the market operator. Thirdly, it allows opportunities for value stacking, which is critical for DER customers gaining greater value through being able to realise cost efficiencies going forward. And finally, this allows an appropriate allocation of the risks as incentives, as DER aggregators are responsible for optimising DER resources while acting in compliance with market rules and connection agreements. So that summarises the key CBA findings. As Alina touched on, there's numerous other documents that have now been published where you can find more detailed write-ups of the various different elements of the CBA and specifically around the assumption and inputs that have ultimately been used to drive the outputs that I just discussed. So what do the findings mean from an implementation perspective? So if we move on to the next slide, you'll see an indicative roadmap for DR implementation and the functionalities tested within Edge on screen. The CBA found that the broad deployment of DOEs for many DR customers and the establishment of a scalable data hub are short-term priorities necessarily for the longer-term value of DER. This figure here represents the incremental cumulative benefit of the scenarios against the base case. As you can see, configurations that are market and DOE configurations that include high DOE customer coverage, a data hub, and more advanced DOEs enable a more beneficial pathway in terms of greater value, as opposed to other less beneficial pathways, which are summarized and characterized by a lower DOE customer coverage, no data hub, and a simple DOE arrangement. And as I spoke to before, it is expected that additional non-quantified benefits will be able to be realized over time, such as the benefits associated with V2G and more innovative and new DR services over time, which are expected. It's expected these benefits will be greater under a data hub approach. Ultimately, the time for action is now in terms of implementing the configurations from both the DOE and market perspective considered within Edge. The timeline for implementing these different configurations has different lead times based on their complexity and sophistication. However, the need for coordinated industry planning is essential, given the lead times that will ultimately be in place. For example, from a DNSP perspective, regulatory submissions are often submitted approximately 18 months in advance of the upcoming regulatory reset period, and therefore proposed expenditure decisions will need to be made in time such that these arrangements can ultimately be implemented. So now speaking to the staggered effect of implementing these arrangements, acknowledging the cross-industry reform efforts to date, unlocking value from DR coordination via BPP participation requires coordinated action. Specifically, the CBA identified 3 immediate foundational priorities to progress towards this outcome, with the first being increasing DOE customer coverage in order to deliver benefits by unlocking network capacity so that more DER can be coordinated via VPPs. The enablement of flexible export limits must be prioritised, and to promote DOE customer coverage, further work is required to inform customers of the benefits of DER integration and to build social license with customers. Secondly, visibility of DER for the market operator and DNSPs is critical to ensure the ongoing secure and reliable supply of electricity. Specifically for the market operator, this entails them being focused on building capabilities to know how and in what volumes DR generation and load will respond to prices and the impact that this will have on the market and the ability to forecast effectively. DNSPs should be focused on investment to uplift monitoring and management of their LV networks and connected DR. This will require DNSPs to invest in monitoring systems and digital platforms to increase visibility and control. And thirdly, an additional immediate foundational priority is a scalable data hub approach to data exchange, which the CBA found can reduce costs and also can allow new DER service-based innovations as to be more easily adopted over time as compared to a point-to-point arrangement. Ultimately, these immediate foundational priorities are underpinned by the arrangement of roles and responsibilities tested within Project Edge. The CBA, in addition, also identified secondary priorities that should be introduced more granularly due to the lead time and complexity in implementing them. Firstly, there is merit in gradually introducing more advanced DOE configurations, and specifically by advanced DOE configurations, we're referring here to an LV impedance model optimization methodology, which refers to the methodology that DNSPs use to set their DOE limits for participating DR, and also a maximum service DOE objective function, which is the objective of the DOE calculation. To do this, DNSPs will need to target implementation of DOEs that are optimized for a given network segment and DR penetration level. And finally, a local service exchange, where the value of a local service, as noted before, is realized in the presence of a network constraint, which are locational and temporal. A targeted approach should be taken here for implementing an LSE based on network needs. I'd now like to hand back over to Alina to summarize and conclude key findings of the CBA.
Thank you so much, Jacob. That was terrific. And thank you also to Ezra for your contribution. What a tremendous amount of work everyone has done going into this CBA and also into Project Edge. So we would just like to impress upon you that building and on the immediate and foundational priorities for unlocking the benefits of coordinated DER, the CBA found that a coordinated market-based approach to DER integration within the NEM, whereby DER aggregators and retailers represent DER customer needs, is economically feasible, and it can deliver value to all electricity customers. 3 immediate opportunities exist to support this integration. 1, the removal of customer constraints, as we've already established, particularly focused on solar exports and enabling customers to participate actively in VPPs by coordinating DER is foundational. Secondly, setting rules for the efficient coordination of DER with clear roles and responsibilities of those market participants. And third, laying the foundations for DER market enablement with an efficient and scalable data exchange, which will reduce costs and enable greater consumer choice. Lastly, we just want to conclude and say that the implementation of these aspects of Project Edge, or as it relates to coordinating DER, are time critical, which is why we've established this investment pathway, as you've seen on a previous slide. And so unlocking some of those benefits in the immediate term is essential for establishing a market that is based on the most efficient operation. So we have identified through the CBA that this will help realize considerable customer value, drive emissions reductions, and help deliver secure, reliable operation of the NEM as we move to a higher DER future. Thank you very much for listening today. We really appreciated all of your time and participation. I want to just remind you, as I described earlier, that we have key documents available in the public domain through the AEMO Project Edge website. So first is the CBA as-built methodology. So again, that is the methodology that was finalized and published in November of 2022 with an addendum that highlights any changes that were made before the finalization of the CBA. The second is a final report, executive summary. So that's a more succinct version of what's in the actual final report, which is the third icon. So download both, read the detailed one, and share maybe the executive summary or have that as a highlight overview. And then lastly, of course, this presentation will be available as well for you to review or share with colleagues on conclusion of today. So thank you very much again for your time. So we'll now move to the Q&A portion of the event. We've had some questions come through in advance, and we've also had some in the presentation today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go ahead and select a couple of questions for the team as a whole to answer. So feel free now, if you haven't had a question of yours answered, if you have anything pressing in your mind that you'd like to hear about, go ahead and drop it into the Slido or like one of the other questions that have been presented. And we have 10 minutes roughly to get through as much of that content as possible. So just going through what we have available here by way of questions, I see we have quite a number of likes for the first one, so I'll go ahead and read that one first. So the question we have from participants today is, does the CBA calculate the monetized benefit for an individual end consumer? Because if that benefit did not exceed self-consumption, why would they participate? So I think we can toss that one to Ezra. Ezra, would you like to respond to that question?
Thanks, Alina. Because we use an agent-based simulation method, we actually model agents or actual example customers throughout the process. And so we are able to calculate what their return on investments are, what their specific, I guess, financial incentives are. That being said, the basis of the analysis is really on economic costs and benefits and not wealth transfers. And the presumption, or at least the initial presumption, is all of the reduction in the costs of services will ultimately get passed through to consumers through the effects of either regulation or competition. Now, in reality, that's going to be a function of regulators and the level of competition. But we did, in fact, do those calculations. But underpinning the overall techno-economic analysis is that we're focused on economic costs and benefits, and that ultimately they're expected to flow through to customers. Now, how did that work in the CBA, though, Alina?
Jacob, I'd like to pass that one to you, please.
Yeah, certainly. So what we looked at was the total value that could be derived by the DR aggregators, and naturally, given the DR aggregators in control of the DR consumers, it's assumed that a proportion of this value will ultimately flow through to the DR consumers in the form of lower cost and greater service opportunities.
And greater choice. Terrific. I'll go to the next question then. So we have a question now, which is, were any costs considered for the maximize service DOE objective function to maintain social license while unequally allocating the DOE between neighbors? Jacob, I think that one might be for you.
So just in terms of that one there, so definitely in terms of the maximum service DOE objective function, the cost we looked at there was in terms of the market participant costs necessary to implement the capabilities specifically required to enable that maximum service amount. And obviously within that, there's a social license element that can be considered and ensured going forward.
Terrific, thank you. Now we've had a couple of questions here asking about avoided transmission upgrades or any deviation from what has been expressed perhaps in the ISP. I think we might combine some of those questions together to address how the CBA factors in the avoided cost of transmission and distribution upgrades. Jacob, I think also that one's probably for you.
So the techno-economic modelling obviously looked at avoided costs for DNSPs and TNSPs associated with the various different scenarios. It's worth noting that the edge assumptions are underpinned by the 2022 ISP, DR uptake and VPP assumptions. And the assumption wasn't made that based on any of the findings, the need to negate any of the ISP projects.
Perfect, thank you. Now, we had a question earlier, Ezra, that I would love you to address. Now, we've talked a little bit about the importance of the techno-economic modeling in the CBA, but that's a techno-economic model isn't traditionally included in a CBA. Would you mind just speaking a little bit to why a techno-economic model was critical for this particular piece of work?
Oftentimes, cost-benefit assessments are pulled together through existing public information sets in the public domain. Because this is on the cutting edge of the industry, there are no real sources upon which to draw, and we were really testing potential future arrangements, and therefore it really helped make the cost-benefit assessment more realistic and accurate by subjecting it to pretty detailed techno-economic modeling. I mean, within AusNet's network, we modeled all their feeders, all their substations, we modeled all their customers, and then we fed that up through transmission and then the wholesale market. So as a result, there are tailored costs and benefits that are very much aligned to the actual scenarios that were considered.
Excellent, thank you. Now, we've had a question come in yesterday that we've also seen today, so I wanted to address this one next. The question is, what is the total investment from market participants required to access the benefits? Jacob, would you mind taking that one?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Elaine. So obviously the CBA has considered the incremental investment costs for the market operator, DNSPs and aggregators to implement the arrangements tested within Edge. And across the 20-year time horizon, noting that that includes both establishment costs and ongoing operational costs, with the cost being naturally weighted towards those initial years in establishing the capabilities across aggregator platforms, DERM platforms, the data hub, the LSE, and enabling the capabilities of visibility. We found that in aggregate, those investment costs range from approximately $0.92 billion in scenario 3 through to over $3 billion under the most extreme scenario tested, which was scenario 10. But just want to really emphasize that they are across the full 20-year time horizon and include not only the establishment costs, but also the ongoing operational costs. And those ongoing operational costs are obviously driven by the levels of market participation. And naturally, we've had to make some assumptions there in the CBA in terms of what DER aggregator participation and DNSP participation looks like for some of these DOE and market configurations. And if you refer to both Chapter 2 and 3 of the final report, you'll see some of the detail around the specific line items of the costs and also kind of what are the key assumptions that underpin those costs.
Great. Great segue into the next question around assumptions that underpin the CBA. I wanted to ask a question, one of our more popular ones, around what rule changes were assumed in the base case. Jacob, would you mind speaking to that?
Certainly. Thanks, Lena. So the implementation of rule changes requiring new DER installations to comply with flexible export limits was assumed, and it was assumed that DER customer product to enable active DER to be separately managed from passive load would be available. Specific to the theme of visibility, no implementation of scheduled light type participation arrangements was assumed in the base case. However, it was assumed in all other scenarios. Therefore, in the base case, limiting the level of market operator and DNSP visibility of DER.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone's used Slido before. They do bounce around a lot. We have a question here. Does the CBA assess the avoided CapEx from flexible export and import limits? Sorry, I think, Jacob, would you mind tackling that one with Ezra as well? You feel free to work together.
Yeah, I was going to hand over to Ezra for that one if you wanted to speak to the deferred CapEx. Yep.
Yeah, I think it does. In that we have different levels of dynamic operating envelope impacts, and those different levels impact on the level of PV curtailment and the need, connection, but also curtailment. And so through the scenario modeling approach, where you can compare it to the base case counterfactual, we're looking. It does include what the incremental impacts are from having more different levels of sophistication of dynamic operating envelopes across not just CapEx and OpEx for distribution, the whole value chain.
Absolutely. Well, everyone, thank you so much for your time today. I think we've reached the maximum number of questions that we can answer, given it's 11 o'clock. 12 o'clock. I'm in Brisbane. Apologies. We will take note of any of the questions we didn't get to and see if we can respond separately out of session. Thank you so much for your time today. We'll be closing then. Thank you.
Thank you.